And so the last question says, or set of questions says, what are the four phases of the business cycle? I think there's just multiple questions being asked here, so we can just go over these one by one. So the four phases of the business cycle, I think it's best to just illustrate this through a graph. Business cycle graph. Right, and so this is probably going to be the one that, this is probably the one that best matches what most of the time you'll see in most classes. So we have this idea of a trough, which is this distance between, the trough is the low point in the business cycle. You have your expansion point, which is the time in which you're returning from a trough or a low point to a peak. At a peak, you are maximizing your actual growth, and then you're contracting to go to the next trough. And so you're rotating through a cycle of trough, expansion, peak, contraction, right? And so that's going to usually follow an upward trend over the long term, and that's going to be what the business cycle is characterized by. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. And they said that the four phases of the business cycle are trough, expansion, peak, and recession. So, right, recession and contraction are sometimes used interchangeably. I think contraction is a little bit more accurate, so maybe I would stick with that term. But yeah, so the same answer is given by the previous tutor. The second question says, how long do business cycles last? So this seems to be purely a empirical, memorization, fact-based question, no calculation involved. I believe the answer is about 5.5 years, but we can, that's really just an average, and it can range anywhere from 2 years to maybe even longer. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And they said empirically, the length of a complete cycle on average moves within a range of 2 to 3 years to more than 8 years, and so it's somewhere in that range, I believe. Let me see, business cycle duration. Yeah, so from the year 1945 to the year 2009, the NBER defined 11 cycles, with the average cycle lasting a bit over 5.5 years. And so something along this range. I would not put too much emphasis on memorizing kind of these random facts. More so understanding the general concepts would be a more efficient use of your time. So the next question says, why does the business cycle affect output and employment in capital goods industries and consumer durable goods industries more severely than in industries producing consumer non-durables? And so we can think of non-durables as things like food or something like that, whereas durables would be things like cars, or capital would be something like equipment or something like that, right? So the idea is, why does business cycle affect the output and employment in those durable goods industries rather than the non-durable goods industries more? And so the reason for that is because durable goods industries, you can delay your consumption of most of those goods, right? Those durable goods are usually not as necessary in terms of the short term, and they're not necessarily priorities for consumers at all times. If they're durable goods, you might have already purchased them at a previous point in time, and so because they are durable goods and they last long periods of time, you're not in the market to purchase those goods anymore, especially if they're expensive now. You might also say, because they're durable goods, they're less needed for you right now, so you can delay your purchasing of those goods until a time in which you have more money during expansion or a peak portion of the business cycle. On the other hand, consumer non-durables like food can be stored for long periods of time, and they will either expire or be consumed fairly frequently. And so that requires consumers to more frequently purchase and repurchase those goods. And so because of that emphasis on urgency or need, even if you're in a business cycle contraction or trough, consumers are most likely still buying those goods because they need to be refilled in the household. And so that's going to be the main reason that non-durables are a little bit more recession-proof than durable goods. And so we can take a look at the previous tutor's answer to see if they gave a similar rationale. So the previous tutor said there is a natural difference between capital good industries in consumer durable goods and consumer non-durable industry. That difference is urgency. Usually and mostly in recession, people postpone their planning of purchase for consumer durable goods, but non-durable goods such as food can't be postponed for long periods. Thus, in recession, capital goods industries and consumer durable goods industries suffer more acutely and make these industries more worse off than the effect on consumer non-durable goods industries. So yeah, that's a good answer. Again, that sentiment of urgency or need, that's why non-durables are going to be more recession-proof. So the next question says, why is it difficult to distinguish between frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment? So I think this is a good place to break down difference between these three types of employment. I think this is a commonly asked question, a commonly place where professors are making sure you know the distinction. And so we categorize employment into three categories: frictional, structural, and cyclical. Frictional and structural make up what we know as the natural rate of unemployment, and then a natural rate of unemployment plus cyclical unemployment will give us actual unemployment. So that's going to be the relationship between the three types of unemployment. Frictional unemployment refers to unemployment as a result of the job search. So it's unemployment in an economy where even if there were only 100 workers and there were exactly 100 jobs, where you might say there should be no unemployment because there's exactly enough jobs for anybody who wants one. The idea of frictional unemployment is that in this ideal economy, unemployment would still exist because people are going to be going through the process of job search, where we're looking for a job in which they looking for a job that is best suited to both their skill set and their interest. And so new jobs are always being created, old jobs are always being destroyed, and so that turnover and process by which people switch jobs and find the right one for them is going to lead to some sort of unemployment as well. So that's what we call frictional unemployment. Structural unemployment refers to situations in which the economy simply does not have enough of the right types of jobs for the number of people looking for jobs. And so rather than an economy where there's 100 people and 100 jobs, there might be 100 people and only 90 jobs. And so this mismatch between the number of workers and the number of jobs available, that unemployment is more long-term and is also a result of is also what we would categorize as structural unemployment. And so reasons that you might have gone over in class for why there might be structural unemployment can be due to minimum wage, that employers are being forced to pay above equilibrium wages, and that leads to a surplus of labor, which makes up unemployment. You might also hear about strong labor unions in which they're negotiating higher than equilibrium wages, or efficiency wages where employers are being motivated to pay their workers at a higher than equilibrium level in order to encourage efficiency, but that leads to a surplus of employment as well, a surplus of labor as well. And so all those reasons are reasons by which there might not be enough jobs for everybody who wants one in the economy. And finally, cyclical unemployment is simply unemployment that results from the business cycle, especially the portions in time where you're in the contraction or trough portion of the cycle. And if the economy is just simply growing slower than it usually is, then that's going to lead to higher unemployment. And that's why we would have a classification of unemployment called cyclical unemployment. And so those are the three types of unemployment. And the reason it can be different to distinguish between frictional, structural, and cyclical is because a lot of the times these root reasons for unemployment can be interchangeable. So it's possible that somebody's in the process for searching for a job, and that might be frictional unemployment, but it also could be harder for them to search for a job because there's simply less of the jobs suited for their skill set that they qualify for, and that could be kind of a mix of both frictional and structural employment. You're job searching for jobs that aren't impossible to find, but harder to find because there's less of them. And then you can also say, well, maybe the reason that it's so hard to find a job right now is because you're in a recession, and that's part of cyclical unemployment. And so these reasons can all kind of interact in a way where it might be hard to distinguish between the three. So we can take a look at the previous year's answer to see if they wrote something similar. So they wrote that it is very difficult or sometimes impossible to distinguish between these three types of unemployment because they can interplay. For example, a person who quits a job in search of a better one would normally be considered frictionally unemployed, but suppose the former job then disappears completely because the firm is in a declining industry and can no longer make money, our still jobless worker can now be considered structurally unemployed And then suppose the economy slips into a severe recession so that our worker cannot find any job and he becomes cyclically unemployed. It simply means that one can't be figuring out the accurate reason and cause behind one's unemployment. Nobody roams with a description on their head that shows why this man is unemployed. Sure, so basically again, talking about how there's a lot of interplay between the reasons someone might be unemployed, and that is going to result in a certain level of confusion between which classification of unemployment we might be dealing with. Next question says, why is unemployment an economic problem? And so we've always known that unemployment is usually an indicator of overall economic growth. Usually if there's high unemployment, we would typically be in a contraction or a recession portion of a business cycle. Unemployment leads to a loss of economic efficiency because people are willing to be employed, they're willing to contribute to efficient production of goods or services, but they simply are not given the opportunity to do so. That's going to cause a loss of potential productivity. And unemployment can be expensive. Unemployment will require a higher disbursement of transfer payments in forms of unemployment benefits. There might be a greater drain on welfare resources in the economy from the government. And so all these reasons are kind of consequences that unemployment has in terms of economic efficiency, and that makes this an economic problem. So again, this is a really broad question, so there's multiple answers. So we can take a look at the previous tutor's answer, and they might have said something different. So they said that when one becomes unemployed, it costs them in a number of ways. The time that could be used in production, if they could be employed, now has been wasted in non-productive work like leisure because people don't have a job. The time wasted in frivolous activities as an opportunity cost of wages that could be earned if they had been employed in some productive activity. So I think that's kind of hitting on some of the points we talked about, but there's other reasons. Unemployment is also an economic problem because of lost productivity. It can have implications for the level of transfer payments from the government. It can, and so there's a lot of different reasons in which we might see unemployment have economic effects. The next question says, what are the consequences of a negative GDP gap? And so a negative GDP gap is given by a situation, we can see this on the dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So we have our long-term GDP, long-run aggregate supply. We have our short-run demand, and then we have our short-run aggregate supply. And so we would have a short-run equilibrium at this point where we have this gap between short-run equilibrium quantity produced and long-run aggregate supply, which is long-run GDP, potential GDP. And that's what we refer to as a negative GDP gap, right? And so the reason that this is going to be bad is because this gap means there's going to be a permanent loss of productivity because you're underperforming in terms of growth, in terms of the economy. You're not outputting at the potential GDP level, and so everything that is not outputted now will be lost forever because you can't make up for that in future periods of time. And so that's going to be the main impact of a negative GDP gap. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. I think for this question, the most important thing to understand is simply that this is the graph that we're talking about. So the GDP graph is the difference. The GDP gap is the difference between the economy's potential GDP, aka long-run aggregate supply, and its actual GDP. The consequence of a negative GDP gap is that what is not produced is lost forever. Moreover, to the extent that this lost production represents capital goods, potential production for the future is impaired. Future economic growth will be lower. And that is also true if you don't invest as much in the current period, then growth in future periods will be lower as well. And so again, there are a lot of ways in which you could talk about the broad abstract consequences of a negative GDP gap. In my opinion, the important thing for you to know is just how do you visualize this on the graph, and therefore you can kind of be able to mess around with that when the question asks you to. And the final question says, what are the non-economic effects of unemployment? And so there are several, and again, well, this is not really in the span or in the scope of economics as we think of it, but unemployment can have a lot of health impacts as well, and individual impacts on the people who are unemployed. A lack of financial stability can lead to financial strain on the household, can lead to a decline in health, can lead to psychological burdens, and all those things are going to be detrimental to the individual who is unemployed. Other non-economic effects of unemployment, there could be repercussions in terms of, I guess these are still economic impacts. So, I mean, I think that's a big one. That the impact on the individual who is unemployed is a big non-economic effect, non-quantifiable effect that can still be really serious and that should still be really thought about in conjunction with unemployment. We can take a look at what the previous term I've said to get some better ideas. So we talk about lack of productive activity can result in poverty, increase in crime, clash in family, mental and physical illness, instability in the social political economy, and many more. And so I do agree. High unemployment has often times been tied to higher crime rates, and so that stuff is also going to be non-economic, not directly economic in impact, but things that we would consider when we are considering the social impacts of unemployment. And so I think, again, that's going to be a good answer as well. So a lot of these questions, I think, especially for this set, are pretty broad questions with really abstract answers. There are a lot of ways we can answer these questions. And so don't worry about matching your answers specifically to what I have said or what the tutor has said, as long as you're understanding the general gist of the concepts being tested. For example, maybe it's not so important to answer the question of why is it difficult to distinguish between frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment, but it is important to understand the distinction between those three. And so that's going to be where I think you should focus your efforts the most. I believe this is going to be the last question that we have for today. We're going to mark the solution as correct. And so, yeah, hopefully this was helpful for you guys. We're going to be doing this again next week on Tuesday. And so, other than that, I hope everybody's staying happy and healthy at home. And I'll see you guys again next week.